good time to shift gears into COVID, because we saw a lot of that during the COVID period. 2.5, 3 years, we've come out the other end of it. But obviously there was a lot of, I think a lot of navel gazing and review that has to go on from that. What's your view on the approach taken? I know there were different approaches, but from a federal level, how did it play out? How did it play out that we were locking down businesses, and I know that was a state issue, but allowing these sorts of things to happen in Australia in 2020? Were you troubled by the COVID period in that manner?
When I was the health minister in the Howard government, I did a lot of thinking about potential pandemics. Back in the day, we were worried about a bird flu pandemic because we did have several hundreds of cases of bird flu in China and other parts of East Asia. And that was a very, very deadly disease, something like a 30% case fatality rate. And we feared that any pandemic version, at least initially, would have a very, very high mortality rate, perhaps exceeding the mortality rate of the Spanish flu pandemic back in the 1918, 1919. And in the United States, which then had a population of about 100 million, it's thought that 500,000 people perished as a result of that pandemic. So we all did a lot of thinking back then, and the result of that thinking was a national pandemic plan here in Australia, and there were similar pandemic plans in all of the other major countries. Those plans essentially provided for a strict quarantine on the borders for a period of time during which we would ramp up our hospital system to cope and do our best to protect the elderly. But there was never any thought of ordering people to stay at home, ordering business to close. In fact, we thought that the big challenge would be keeping essential services going, given levels of disease and given the fear that people might have of going abroad under such circumstances. Interestingly, all of the pandemic plans, including our own, were essentially junked in the first weeks of March 2020 in favour of the Wuhan plan. And the Wuhan plan was basically lock everyone up and hope that this virus disappears. Well, once you've got a virus, it's not going to disappear. We've got to learn to live with it, as the pandemic plans accepted. But no, in our better understanding, supposedly better understanding, we went with the Wuhan plan and thought that we could eliminate the virus. Well, we spent the best part of 2 years trying to do that. We inflicted massive damage on ourselves. Yes, we probably did minimise deaths early on by doing this. But in the end, we were always going to have to cope with this. And I certainly think that the first lockdown may have been justifiable, but the subsequent lockdowns certainly weren't.
So how did we get to a point where the Wuhan plan was junked? What in your view made this country turn its back on a pre-prepared plan of attack?
Well, I think it was fear and apprehension that was fueled by the footage coming out of northern Italy in late February, early March 2020 of hospitals apparently being overwhelmed by COVID patients. Now, it was a serious situation, and you do have to ensure that your hospital system can cope, which is why, under the plans that we had in place, we would implement strict quarantine for a period on our borders to delay the advent of the pandemic disease in this country, and in the meantime ramp up our hospital system, in part by designating some hospitals as pandemic hospitals, emptying them of their normal caseload and having them ready to deal with the pandemic illness, and as far as we could, creating extra facilities to deal with that. You might remember back in March, April of 2020, the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, announced that the Victorian government was going to create 4,000 extra ICU beds in Victoria, and in particular was going to turn the exhibition centre in Melbourne into a pandemic ICU centre. The Victorian government, in the end, despite spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars supposedly to create these additional ICU beds, didn't create any additional ICU beds. And that was why they had to keep the state locked down for very, very long periods of time, because they didn't ramp up the health system to deal with additional cases, which you might have early on in any pandemic situation. So look, we took our lead from what was going on in Wuhan. We locked everyone up. Then the idea grew that we could somehow eliminate this virus. We couldn't. And in the meantime, we neglected, particularly in New South Wales, in Victoria rather, particularly in Victoria, we neglected taking the steps that the pandemic plans mandated.
Are we becoming too
risk averse?
Risk averse and directed by global bodies like the World Health Organization? Are we listening too much to them and the UN and other bodies?
Well, in the end, we have to have elected and accountable ministers and heads of government making the appropriate decisions, and sensible ministers and sensible governments certainly take advice from the relevant experts. But in the end, it's the government that has to make the decision. And if the business of government is just following expert advice, why bother with elections? Why bother with parliaments? We'd just do what the officials tell us to do. It would be an official dictatorship, so to speak, as opposed to a liberal democratic regime. And as we now know, we weren't really following official advice, because the official advice varied from month to month and from state to state. And what we were really doing was, I think, being ultra cautious, almost chronically risk averse, when it was pretty clear from April of 2020 on that while this was serious, it certainly wasn't the Black Death. It wasn't even the Spanish flu. And yet we treated it as though it were. And as a result, we spent hundreds of billions of dollars that we shouldn't have spent. And we spent months and months, even years, locked down in ways that were not necessary.